Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Johnston, and I'm the British Ambassador to Ireland, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. This lecture tonight is the first in a series of Glencairn conversations. Glencairn has been the residence of British ambassadors to Ireland since the 1950s, and over the years it's been the venue for many important, in some cases even historical, conversations. And tonight's event, which is about our shared history, kicks off a series of discussions we were running over the course of the next year. The next one being a discussion next Monday, on the 5th of July, about how science can build resilience against future pandemics. But tonight we're looking to the past rather than the future. And you may have noticed that this is not the British Ambassador's residence. For COVID reasons, we're doing Glencairn conversations on tour for the moment. And our tour takes us tonight to the magnificent Aviva Stadium. Had things been a bit different, I might have been here yesterday cheering on England as they played Germany in the European Championships. But tonight, in its own way, in its rather more serious way, is also about an historic rivalry and how that unfolded, in this case, almost exactly 100 years ago. As I prepared to take up my posting as Ambassador to Ireland last September, I tried to read widely about the history of the relationship. And it goes without saying that even today, historical events have strong contemporary resonance. Tonight in particular, we're going to be looking at an inflection point in the so-called decade of centenaries, that period spanning the events of the 1910s and the early 1920s. The year 1921 was, of course, in many ways, a turning point in our history. And legitimately, there are many different and deeply held perspectives about the events of that year. The aim of tonight's event is to look at some pivotal moments from a perspective of mutual respect and, we hope, shared understanding, inclusiveness and reconciliation. We're going to, in particular, consider the period between the state opening of Northern Ireland's Parliament by King George V on the 22nd of June 1921, and the truce in the War of Independence, which came into effect on the 11th of July 1921. And I'm delighted that we're joined by a fantastic panel of historians. In football terms, not so much a flat back four, but 4 star strikers who are going to be talking to us about that crucial month 100 years ago. We have Lord Paul Bew, Emeritus Professor of History at Queen's University Belfast. Paul is chair of the Centenary Historical Advisory Panel, an independent panel of academics which advises the British government on historical matters pertaining to the centenary of Northern Ireland. We have Professor Mary Daly, Emeritus Professor at University College Dublin, and a member of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations, which advises the Irish government on historical matters relating to the decade of centenaries. We have Dr. Maurice Manning, Chancellor of the National University of Ireland and the Chair of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations. And last but very much not least, we have Dr. Marie Coleman, Reader in Modern History, Modern Irish History at Queen's University Belfast, and herself also a member of the Centenary Historical Advisory Panel. We want this to be an inclusive event, and we're looking forward to taking your questions, putting them to our audience, putting them from our virtual audience, from yourselves, to our panel here in the studio. There is a Q&A function, I'm assured, on Zoom, so at any point, please do feel free to post a question in there, and we'll be taking a selection of your questions at the end of the lecture. After some initial discussion amongst the panelists, I'll be fielding questions from your good self. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Marie Coleman for our keynote centenary historical lecture, Between the King's Speech and the Truce.
We're starting tonight with evoking the scenes in Belfast 100 years ago by looking at newsreel footage of the arrival of the King and Queen on the royal yacht. We see here the Queen, followed by the King, alighting at Donegal Quay in Belfast, where they were met by local dignitaries from the Belfast Harbour Commissioners, who formed the first party to greet them. They travelled then by carriage. We see the Queen entering the carriage here. There were a number of dignitaries from the Irish administration who had travelled from Dublin Castle, including the Chief Secretary and the Irish Lord Lieutenant. So all of the important civic office holders and political and administrative office holders in Ireland were there at the time. We cut now to the royal procession making its way through Belfast city centre up towards City Hall, where the ceremonies of the day happened. Of course, the Belfast Parliament had already met in a different setting at Union Theological College, where it was to meet until the new Parliament buildings were built at Stormont, which of course still is the headquarters of the Northern Ireland Assembly. But for this occasion, the more grand surroundings of Belfast City Hall was chosen. We see the extent of the King's entourage, but these views also give us a sense of just how many people turned out in Belfast to greet the King and the Queen on that day, and really give us a sense of the ceremony of the occasion. While this is obviously black and white, I think we can easily imagine the amount of red, white and blue which must have bedecked Belfast on that day. The scenes we're seeing here now are just coming to the front of City Hall, and we see the royal entourage about to enter the grounds of City Hall, which of course had only been inaugurated about 15 years earlier in Belfast, and we see the King passing there the statue of his grandmother, Queen Victoria. Again, we see a select audience here of, including some war veterans, were present in a special place for the reviewing stand on that day. On the front of the Robinson and Cleaver department store there's a large banner saying that Ulster welcomes her King and Queen. A reminder to us that the term Northern Ireland was still one that had yet to come into very much usage. It had been the term chosen in the Government of Ireland Act, but of course the term Ulster was still more evocative from the Unionist perspective. And we can see the King arriving here under the portico at City Hall, and anyone who is familiar with the geography of Belfast and City Hall will easily recognise these views, as the City Hall and its surroundings has not changed very much in the intervening period. We see now the King looking at an honour guard, being received by an honour guard of the Royal Ulster Rifles. And this highlights an important, yet I think overlooked aspect of the King's visit, which was the importance laid on Belfast's and Northern Ireland's, Ulster's contribution to the First World War. And here we see the King being met by the various dignitaries before entering City Hall, where he went on to deliver his speech in what is now the Council Chamber. And I'm going to go on now to discuss that speech and its impact in more detail. The speech delivered by His Majesty King George V at the ceremonial opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament, held at City Hall in Belfast on the 22nd of June 1921, has been the central focus of much of the commentary on historical centenary commemorations recently. Running to just over 600 words, the speech is best remembered for the content of its final third, in which the King appealed to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and to forget. Words that are generally interpreted as constituting an invitation to revolutionary leaders in the South to come to the peace table, which they initially did with the Truce on the 11th of July and subsequently with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December. While there has been much consideration of the content of the speech, in many ways it is almost as significant for what was omitted as what was included. The contrast between this speech and another one delivered by the King just 6 months previously on the occasion of the passing of the Government of Ireland Act, the Partition Act, on the 23rd of December 1920 is very stark. On that occasion, the King's condemnation of Irish Republican violence during the War of Independence was very strong. He told the Westminster Parliament that The state of affairs in Ireland grieves me profoundly. I deplore the campaign of violence and outrage by which a small section of my subjects seek to sever Ireland from the Empire. And I sympathise with the loyal servants of the Crown who are endeavouring to restore peace and maintain order under conditions of unexampled difficulty and danger. It is my most earnest hope that all sections of the people in Ireland will insist upon a return to constitutional methods, which alone can put an end to the terrible events which now threaten ruin on that country and which make reconciliation and make possible reconciliation and lasting peace. No comparable condemnatory phrases are included in the June speech. The furthest he went in expressing an opinion on events in Ireland at that point was to regret the sorrow and anxiety which have clouded of late my vision of Irish affairs. That change in tone between the King's two speeches, only 6 months apart, and the existence of different drafts of the speech highlight two important factors in relation to it: the way in which it reflected a change in British policy towards Ireland and the composite nature of the speech's authorship. If we turn first to looking at the speech in the context of British policy, in the spring of 1921, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson opined to General Sir Neville Macready, the head of the army in Ireland, that the British government faced two options with regard to its policy towards Southern Ireland. It could either go all out or it could get out. The Government of Ireland Act had allowed the British government to divide the Irish question into two parts. By May and June of 1921, the historically more intractable part, Ulster, had been solved, at least to the immediate satisfaction of the British government. Until at least mid-June 1921, the intention with regard to the remaining southern part of the question was Henry Wilson's more draconian policy of going all out, which in practice would have entailed the imposition of Crown colony rule and martial law. On the 24th of May, less than a month before the King's speech, Tom Jones, one of the Cabinet Secretaries in Britain, wrote to Andrew Bonar Law, the recently resigned Conservative Party leader, and told him that there is no change in the policy of the government and there is to be no sign of weakness. On the same date, the Secretary of State for War, Sir Laming Worthington Evans, wanted the government to reinforce the troops in Ireland with everything not actually required elsewhere, so that an endeavour be made to break the back of the rebellion during the 3 months, July, August and September. The IRA's attack on Dublin's Custom House on the 25th of May indicated that the Republican guerrilla campaign showed no signs of waning. So by the 2nd of June, the British government had plans in place to introduce martial law should it be required. Clearly, the direction of government policy was to change rapidly and significantly within the space of the succeeding 3 weeks. The roots of the change in government policy can be traced back to March 1921. Ronan Fanning identified a significant turnover in government advisers at this point as influencing eventual change of direction. In particular, he highlighted the departure of Andrew Bonar Law. The Canadian Ulster Law had traditionally been one of the staunchest parliamentary supporters of Ulster Unionism ever since the pre-war Ulster crisis, during which he was prepared to veto the annual army budget in protest at the prospect of Ulster being unwillingly forced into a Home Rule Parliament. On the 17th of March 1921, Law sensationally stood down from all political office except his parliamentary seat, allegedly on medical grounds, though many commentators ascribe an element of convenience, which facilitated his absence when unpalatable decisions on Ireland were required. Having secured the status of Ulster Unionists, Law could now retire from the front line. Other significant Unionist politicians whose influence also receded at this time in early 1921, now that the Government of Ireland Act had been secured, were Edward Carson and Walter Long. Another strategic departure in March 1921 was that of the King's representative in Ireland, the Lord Lieutenant Field Marshal Lord French, an unreconstructed Unionist, and his replacement by Lord Fitzalan. Though also a well-connected Unionist, Fitzalan's Catholicism, he was the brother of the leading Catholic nobleman in Britain, the Duke of Norfolk, was symbolically significant as he was the first Catholic holder of that post since the reign of James II in the 1680s. A third notable change of personnel occurred at the bureaucratic level, when Philip Kerr departed from his post as private secretary to the Prime Minister to become editor of the Daily Chronicle newspaper. The vacuum left by Kerr's departure allowed one of the Cabinet Secretaries, Tom Jones, and Lloyd George's new private secretary, Edward Grigg, to exert greater influence on the Prime Minister and the direction of the government's Irish policy in a more conciliatory direction. The diary kept by Tom Jones during these years remains one of the most important contemporary accounts of how Irish policy, and especially the chronology of the King's speech, evolved during June 1921. Jones brought a valuable knowledge of Ireland to the table, having served as the first professor of political economy in the newly established Queen's University Belfast in 1909 and 1910. I want to move now to looking at the authorship of the speech, and I've mentioned the role of Edward Grigg, which became more influential after March. It was Lloyd George's secretary, Grigg, who was identified by the King's biographer, Harold Nicholson, as the ultimate author of the version of the speech which was eventually delivered in Belfast. While he might have been the compositor, it was effectively a speech designed by a wider committee of advisors. In addition to the King's version of the speech, there appear to have been at least 2 other drafts, one emanating from the Irish office in Whitehall and one from the newly established Northern Ireland Cabinet. At its meeting on the 15th of June, the Northern Cabinet approved a draft of the speech, though as the draft is not included in the minutes, the content is unclear. Harold Nicholson rejected the claim that the King objected to the version prepared by the Irish office because it lacked in effective humanity, stating that the King had never seen this version. This then appears to be different from the version transmitted to London from the Northern Cabinet. A meeting of the British Cabinet's Irish Situation Committee held on the 16th of June considered the draft submitted by the Northern Cabinet and one suggested to the Prime Minister Lloyd George on the 14th of June by the South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts. The Belfast version was discounted by the King himself, who was reported to be greatly distressed by the sense that he was being shoehorned into being made the mouthpiece of Ulster rather than of the Empire. Whether it was the content of this Northern draft or the principle of a subordinate parliament having the temerity to suggest to the monarch the content of his speech is unclear. To accept the Craig draft would concede the claim of Ulster to dictate the King's utterances and reduce the monarch to a provincial partisan. A suggested draft, which might be either that of the Irish Office or the Northern Cabinet, has recently become available in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. This bears very little resemblance to the final version. It is similar to a modern understanding of a monarch's speech to the opening session of a parliament, setting out the legislative agenda of the government. One version of this draft references plans to develop still further the resources of Northern Ireland, expand trade, improve agriculture and other industries, remodel education, amend the licensing laws, and ensure a brighter future for the great masses of workers. Otherwise, it is largely a descriptive and technical document summarising the contents of the Government of Ireland Act and referencing the establishment of departments for a Prime Minister, Home Affairs, Finance, Labour, Education, Agriculture and Commerce. This version was more direct in addressing the effect of violence in the War of Independence, regretting that violence or disturbance inevitably retards the realisation of that security and social order upon which all hopes of a happy and prosperous country must depend. The Council of Ireland provision of the Government of Ireland Act was identified as something which offered conciliatory potential to lead to the establishment of peace throughout Ireland in certain areas of which the situation causes great anxiety. This is a noticeably insular document concerned largely with the workings of the Northern Parliament and making only one reference to the wider imperial context, noting that the Parliament's labours will be watched with earnest and sympathetic interest throughout the Empire. The location of this speech in the files of the Northern Ireland Public Record Office and the specificity of the putative legislative programme suggests the document originated within the Northern administration and is likely a version of that which was sent to London on the 15th of June. The second version of the speech considered by the British Government's Irish Situation Committee on the 16th of June was proposed by Jan Smuts. The South African Premier had arrived in England earlier in the month to attend the conference of the Dominion Prime Ministers. The coincidence of Smuts' presence in London was a significant factor in the wider context of moves towards peace in Ireland. As a former rebel guerrilla leader of the Boers against the British, Smuts was well placed to understand both the military and political dynamics of the conflict in the south of Ireland. In his letter to Lloyd George of the 14th of June, he expressed plainly his view that the situation in Ireland was unwinnable from a British perspective in terms of tactics, cost and prestige, And this entire text of Smuts' letter and the appendix, which he suggested as a version of the speech, is contained in that very valuable document I spoke about earlier, Tom Jones's diary of the period. In his letter to Lloyd George, Smuts wrote quite plainly, "The present situation is an unmeasured calamity. It is a negation of all the principles of government which we have professed as the basis of the empire, and it must more and more tend to poison both our empire relations and our foreign relations. Besides, the present methods are frightfully expensive in a financial, no less than a moral sense, and what is worse, they have failed." His letter was not entirely doom-laden. Recognising that partition and the establishment of governmental structures in Northern Ireland eliminates the coercion of Ulster, he observed astutely that the road is now clear to deal on the most statesmanlike lines with the rest of Ireland. Smuts identified the unique opportunity offered by the King's planned visit to Belfast to send a signal to the Sinn Féin leaders in the south that would indicate the British government's willingness to work towards a peaceful settlement. Though questioning the advisability of even going, of whether the King should go at all, his decision to do so would be fully justified if the occasion were made use of by him to make a really important declaration on the whole question. The nature of that declaration should be an offer to Southern Ireland of the status of a Commonwealth dominion, putting it on a par with Smuts' own nation, South Africa, in addition to Australia, Canada and New Zealand. If the content of the offer to be made was significant, of equal significance was the messenger. The offer of dominion status would only carry weight if offered by the King. Smuts recognised that the Irish might accept it as coming from the King. Past dealings with the Prime Minister Lloyd George over Home Rule in 1916, conscription in 1918, and more recently the failed Clune peace mission of the previous winter, had made Irish nationalist leaders of various hues understandably distrustful of Lloyd George. Smuts' belief that the Irish would be receptive was not misplaced and was the product of back-channel communications with two influential Irish figures, Colonel Maurice Moore and Tom Casement. Moore was appointed as the First Dáil's representative to South Africa in 1921. He had previous knowledge of South Africa, having served there with the Connaught Rangers during the Boer War, where his disgust at the treatment of South African civilians by the British led him to pen anonymous critical articles for the newspaper The Freeman's Journal. Moore's diplomatic task was to promote the case for the recognition of the Irish Republic with Smuts. Writing back to the Dáil's Department of Foreign Affairs in early June 1921, around the time of Smuts' arrival in London, he explained the political realities in South Africa made this task difficult because Smuts could not advocate a republic for Ireland and oppose it in South Africa. Yet he had brought Smuts to the point of advocating for Dominion status and felt that Smuts' desire to settle the Irish question was genuine. "I believe him to be very anxious to settle the matter satisfactorily, or as nearly satisfactorily as possible for the Irish, while not taking any action that would compromise his own political career." On arrival in London, further lobbying of Smuts was undertaken by Tom Casement, an older brother of the executed 1916 leader Roger Casement, who, like Moore, had served in the British Army on the opposite side to Smuts during the Boer War, but subsequently became a closer acquaintance of the South African general, serving under his command in the more recent East Africa campaign during the First World War. The elder Casement acted as an intermediary for subsequent meetings between De Valera and Smuts in the interregnum between the King's speech and the truce. The letter which Smuts addressed to Lloyd George was accompanied by a suggested text for inclusion in the new version of the King's speech. Much of the sentiment of his letter influenced the final version of the speech, including the King's expression of his affection for Ireland, his anxiety at the present state of affairs, and the desire to settle the remainder of the Irish question now that the Ulster aspect had been resolved. However, the speech did not mirror the language employed by Smuts to express these ideas. The Irish Situation Committee felt that Smuts' rhetoric was too emotive and overly contrite with regard to British responsibility for violence in Ireland. It was deemed to contain too much innuendo of oppression, presumably referring to suggested phrases such as the trials and sorrows through which Ireland is passing and the desire to lead Ireland out of the miseries of the present. The Irish Situation Committee then tasked one of its members, Arthur Balfour, with the job of amending Smuts' language while retaining his sentiments. Balfour was one of the most prominent political figures of late 19th and early 20th century Britain. and one of the longest serving MPs in Parliament at the time, having first been elected in 1885. By the early 1920s, he was the last Conservative to have held the prime ministerial office in the fractious government of 1902 to 1906. Crucially, he had a long association with Ireland, serving as Chief Secretary between 1887 and 1891, at the height of land agitation during the Planoff campaign and the intense political turmoil surrounding demands for Home Rule, the Parnell Commission and the eventual sundering of the Irish Party over the O'Shea divorce case. While Balfour had an unenviable reputation in Ireland, earning the sobriquet of Bloody Balfour for his coercive measures against land agitators, he was acutely aware of the underlying causes of Irish unrest, especially the system of land tenure. And his time in Ireland was also marked by the introduction of 2 Land Acts and the establishment of the Congested Districts Board to alleviate poverty and promote agricultural and industrial development in the country's poorest regions. The second half of the King's speech, as delivered, is almost a verbatim replication of the draft produced by Balfour. And I've just put the 2 texts up beside each other. I know they're quite dense texts, but I've just highlighted the differences in red to show how similar what the King said was with what was suggested by Arthur Balfour. This underlines Balfour's significance as one of its architects, locates the sentiments underlying the speech in a much longer trajectory of British policy towards Ireland, and also highlights the importance of the Conservative majority in the coalition government in influencing the final version of the Irish solution that emerged between 1919 and 1921. While the result of the 1918 general election from an Irish perspective is often focused exclusively on Sinn Féin's sweep of seats in the south, the outcome in British constituencies determined Ireland's future within the United Kingdom. Although the Liberal leader Lloyd George remained as Prime Minister, the influence of the Conservative majority within that government is nowhere more obvious than in the evolution of Irish policy, in particular the rejection of the Long Committee's recommendation of a 9-county Ulster in favour of the Ulster Unionist preference for 6. Balfour's direct input into the King's speech offers further evidence of the Conservative imprint on Irish policy. His prior realisation, while Chief Secretary in the 1880s, of the need to find a balance between coercion and conciliation, albeit often a reluctant concession in his case, is also noticeable in the enticement offered to Sinn Féin to engage. But a crucial part of the final half of the speech did not emanate from Balfour's version. The most significant line in the text, in which the King appealed for forgiving and forgetting, has a sufficient personal element to suggest it came largely from the monarch himself, and echoes his affection for Ireland expressed at the outset of his oration, in which he recalled with fondness the many happy days he had spent in Ireland during his naval career. Now, this appears to have been a fairly limited experience of cruising around Bantry Bay on HMS Beshant between July and August of 1880. The King's more intimate experience dates from his first official visit as Duke of York in 1897, when his biographer Harold Nicholson notes that he was so impressed by the loyalty manifested by the inhabitants that he tried unsuccessfully to convince his grandmother Queen Victoria to establish a royal residence near Dublin. That visit, according to Nicholson, left the King with a personal affection for Ireland and a conviction, which he never relinquished, that, in spite of the politicians, there existed a sentimental bond of affection between the Irish people and the Crown. This affection for Ireland, an overly optimistic sense of a mutual Irish attitude to the British Crown, underpins his speech of 24 years later. The King's attitude to Ireland emerges elsewhere throughout the speech. His reference to "my Irish people" reflects his view of the Irish, even if 3/4 of them had no desire to be seen by him, nor see themselves as his people. It also illustrates his personal interest in and concern of events in Ireland during the War of Independence. The significant change in tone between the speeches of December 1920 and June 1921 might in part reflect his own growing opposition to British actions in Ireland, especially the policy of official reprisals. In particular, he wished to see the disbandment of the Black and Tans. Therefore, in consideration of the authorship of the speech, the input of the King himself needs to be recognised. However, the significance of the King arguably lies as much, if not more, in his role as messenger as in the content of his message. Writing immediately afterwards to congratulate the King on the success of his speech, Lloyd George acknowledged what Smuts had predicted, that none but the king could have made that personal appeal, none but the king could have evoked so instantaneous a response. The significance of the king as a non-political figure was crucial to Sinn Féin accepting the good faith of the message. The king himself was satisfied with his contribution, confiding in his diary that, "I think my speech was appreciated. Our visit was a great success, and everything has gone off beautifully. We really got a wonderful welcome, and I never heard anything like the cheering." And I think those words fit in very well with the newsreel footage, although it was silent, that we saw at the outset. Having explored the significance of the authorship and of the messenger, it is instructive to focus on some of the specific aspects of the message itself, which in turn can help to identify the different audiences at which it was aimed. The nearest audience was, of course, those members of the new House of Commons and Senate of Northern Ireland and various other political and civic dignitaries present in City Hall, and we saw some of them in the newsreel footage. The compliment paid in the speech to the patriotic devotion to the Empire, which you proved so gallantly in the Great War, was an acknowledgement of the significance of the Unionist contribution to Britain's war effort, which in many ways would become the foundation narrative of Northern Ireland. As we saw in the newsreel footage briefly, the resonance of the war was present in other ways on that day. On the way into City Hall, the King reviewed an honour guard of the Royal Ulster Rifles, and war veterans were accorded a special viewing position at the front of the building. The sacrifice of war veterans, especially those living with a disability in the war's aftermath, was given further recognition by the King in a second speech, which he delivered later in the day to a civic event at the Ulster Hall, where he paid tribute to all who served, men and women alike, and offered his heartfelt sympathy to those who have suffered by disablement or loss. A further royal direction, aimed specifically at the legislators present to manage the new Parliament's affairs with moderation and fairness and due regard to every faith and interest, was one which the devolved government of Northern Ireland would fail to live up to over the course of the next 50 years. The speech was clearly intended to reach far beyond Irish shores. The Empire is referenced 6 times in the text, and the King's awareness that the eyes of the whole Empire are on Ireland today reflected Jan Smuts' direction to Lloyd George of the importance of the Irish question for the Empire as a whole. The King and his ministers were well aware that a failure to resolve the Irish conflict would cause concern within the Dominions and have an adverse effect on Britain's international prestige. The centrality of imperial references in the speech reflects the influence of Smuts' advice in his letter to Lloyd George of the 14th of June, where he recommended the occasion be used to proffer the prospect of Dominion status to Sinn Féin. While that term, Dominion status, is not used explicitly within the text, the monarch's desire to see a similar legislature inaugurated in Southern Ireland, combined with the resonance of the Empire, indicate clearly that the King saw any such parliament operating within the imperial framework. The clear implication was that Southern Ireland could have self-determination, but a link to the Empire would be retained. The limit of sovereignty which the British government was prepared to concede to Southern Ireland was signposted here in June 1921, so that the refusal to allow complete severance of the Free State as a republic, which happened under the treaty, should have come as no surprise to anyone paying due attention to the underlying message of the speech. The signal given by the King was recognised almost immediately by Sinn Féin. The King himself was desirous of maintaining the momentum of his speech, urging the government not to miss the psychological moment for taking advantage of it. As a result, on the 24th of June, Lloyd George wrote to Eamon de Valera and James Craig, inviting them to London for talks. De Valera prevaricated, largely over the inclusion of Craig, but did not reject the notion outright. At this juncture, another significant intervention came from Jan Smuts, who met De Valera in Dublin on the 5th of July. An intricate web of communications followed over the next 3 days, involving Smuts, De Valera, members of the government, Lord Middleton representing the Southern Unionists, the Dublin Castle civil servants, and the head of the army, General Macready. Eventually, the terms of the truce were agreed at a conference held at the Mansion House on Saturday, the 9th of July, to come into effect at noon on the following Monday, the 11th of July. A question arises here of whether the IRA could have continued its guerrilla campaign beyond mid-July. Military historians of the conflict generally agree that it had reached a stalemate by this juncture. The IRA had been depleted by arrests, executions, and accidental deaths and injuries. The Crown forces had become better attuned to avoiding ambushes, and greater use was made of military searches to round up suspects. The IRA had ceased to be active in areas of the country where previously it had been responsible for inflicting significant losses on the Crown forces. On the other hand, previously dormant areas such as Mayo had emerged as new centres of resistance, where two high-profile ambushes at Tormakady on the 3rd of May and Carrackennedy on the 2nd of June had resulted in the deaths of 5 policemen in each ambush. The importation of a significant consignment of Thompson submachine guns from America signified a potentially new addition to the IRA's arsenal. Nevertheless, IRA General Headquarters remained concerned about the force's overall ability to hold out for much longer. In the end, these concerns on the Irish side and the British desire to avoid a resort to a combination of Crown colony rule and martial law explain why the truce was a mutually suitable accommodation. While the truce followed within 3 weeks of the King's speech, caution must be exercised against assuming an inevitable causation. The path between both events was a rocky one. The benefit of the King's gambit was almost undone the following day by the unintentional arrest of De Valera. The arrest embarrassed the British administration in Ireland, who tried unsuccessfully to suppress news of it and ordered his immediate release. The fragility of the peace was further reinforced by the ambush of one of the trains carrying troops and horses which had taken part in the King's Honour Guard back to Dublin. The attack was undertaken by the IRA's 4th Northern Division, based in North Louth and South Down, under the command of Frank Aiken. 3 soldiers from the 10th Royal Hussars, reportedly up to 80 horses, and a civilian railway guard were killed, while a local farm labourer was shot as a reprisal by the military. This ambush raises the question of the security surrounding the royal visit and the risk of undertaking it at a time when Ireland, and especially Belfast, was so disturbed. Many of the King's advisers questioned the wisdom of his trip, as did Jan Smuts, and Neville Macready, the head of the army, was anxious lest wild men from the south might elude the vigilance of the police and attempt to disturb the proceedings by promiscuous bomb throwing. An elaborate security operation was put in place, and it has also been suggested that the decision of the Queen to accompany him might have been designed to prevent an attack on him in person, in the belief that the presence of a woman might deter would-be assailants. A question exists also about whether the Belfast IRA possessed the wherewithal to execute such a spectacular. Politically, militarily and diplomatically, any such assault on the King would have been disastrous for the Republican movement. International opinion would have swung back in sympathy with Britain. The tentative moves towards peace, which were as much in Sinn Féin's interest as those of the British government, would probably have ceased immediately, and the Catholic population of Belfast would likely have borne the brunt of a serious violent backlash from loyalists. The ongoing death toll from political violence represents the strongest caveat about exaggerating the immediate impact of the King's speech on the cessation of hostilities. The new compendium of the dead of the Irish Revolution records that in the days between the 22nd of June 1921 and the 11th of July, 162 more people lost their lives in incidents related to the conflict. We see here for the rest of June, 58 deaths. And I think even more significantly, as we get closer to the truce, we see the death toll for July, for the first 11 days of July. And of most significance there is the deaths which took place on Sunday, the 10th of July. 34 deaths in Ireland. 14 of those 34 deaths recorded in that day took place in Belfast. According to the dead of the Irish Revolution, this is the highest death toll of any of the days during the War of Independence, outstripping even Bloody Sunday of November 1921, on which they record 31 deaths. Though known as the King's Speech, the content of the monarch's oration at the inauguration of the Northern Ireland Parliament was in reality the work of multiple authors, reflecting the historic dynamics of British politics towards Ireland, wider imperial interest in Ireland's future relationship with the Empire, and an immediate desire to bring peace to Ireland after 2.5 years of conflict. As Jan Smuts predicted and Lloyd George confirmed, the King as messenger was crucial to bringing Sinn Féin into negotiations. Nevertheless, the ongoing death toll, especially in the city where the speech was delivered, both between the opening of the Parliament and the Truce, and indeed over the course of the rest of the year, should lend caution in exaggerating the significance of the Truce in bringing peace to Ireland.
Well, thank you very much to Marie Coleman for that fascinating insight into the lead up to the King's speech and the 2.5 weeks in between the speech and the truce. And I'm going to turn now to Marie's 3 fellow panellists to get their initial reactions to what she said before moving into a question and answer session. So first, Paul Bugh, from your perspective, some initial reactions to Marie's talk.
First of all, thank you for Marie for what I thought was a really superb exposition of a critical moment in Irish history. And I really want to add 3 glosses, really. The first, speculative. Professor Keith Middlemass, who edited Tom Jones's papers and therefore knew Jones, suggested that apart from Smuts, one other author in the background for the King's speech was actually Eamon de Valera himself, that it partly reflected signals that were coming from Dublin and Sinn Féin as well. And in this atmosphere at that time, there were lots of people going back and forth with suggestions, if only you'd say this, we could make progress and so on. And that's just an interesting thought. It's not proven in any sense, it's speculative, but Middlemass, who's now dead, but what was knew people from that period and was a very serious scholar, and the fact that he suggests it might be possible is something worth considering. The other point about the speech, which I think is very important, but at this moment we're still living in a time when, slightly to my surprise, people still talk about Britain carving out the 6 counties or talk about it in that way. Because actually I thought Irish history writing had gone beyond that idea, and for one obvious reason, that the fundamental reason for partition is the fact that there are 2 distinct political communities. W.F. Moneypenny said in his famous book at the time, the great Times journalist, 2 Irish nations. You don't have to accept that formula, but there clearly were 2 distinct political communities. And secondly, of course, the speech talks about 1 parliament or 2. So it's actually saying we could have a line development here, which leads to 1 Irish parliament. The speech is not a speech against Irish unification. It's saying it's really implying that on the basis of Dominion status, there might be a basis for the coming together of the 2 parliaments, or an agreement to have 1 Irish parliament. So it's not a case for partition. The speech with 1 Irish parliament or 2. It's the very words that appear in the speech. It tells you that as far as Britain is concerned, an all-Ireland Dominion settlement is acceptable. It may not be, and many British politicians accept it, acceptable if you impose it on the North, if you ignore the consent principle, something that we still live with. But as far as Britain is concerned, in Britain's own internal interest, it was entirely acceptable. Stephen Gwynn, the Nationalist MP, or former Nationalist MP for Galway, said at the time, there is nothing that is not Irish which stands in the way of Irish unity. In other words, it's essentially an Irish division, and that's part of the message of the King's speech. And one final thing I'd want to add as a final gloss. I thought your discussion of the dynamic in British politics between military initiatives and people who were doves and looking for peace was absolutely excellent. The truth is that the British government really has a choice. It's fighting a dirty war, on the whole successfully, because you only have to look what Michael Collins says. You're quite right. South Mayo, there are IRA groups coming in and are active, which weren't active before. But Collins is the man who knew best, and he knew that the IRA was reaching some kind of terminus point. And he says it again and again in speeches to the Irish people in the frankest possible terms. And he says, look, we couldn't go on, and nor could they go on. Their self-respect was affected by the fact that on the whole, the British thought they'd fought the First World War with a degree of honour, and now the methods used in Ireland, they were the methods of a dirty war. They were actually extremely effective by the summer of 1921, but that was, they were morally compromising, and therefore, eventually, and the really interesting thing here is Winston Churchill, chair of that Irish committee, who is very hard for tough methods. And then by May 1921, has made up his mind. They've worked. Now we've softened them enough. It's got to be talks, and he's behind all this sort of process of dialogue remarkably quickly. And also, perhaps just finally worth saying, Sir James Craig is part of this. On May the 5th, he goes to meet De Valera in Dublin at the behest of the doves in Dublin Castle, people like Andy Cope. And he goes for those talks. Now, the point is, the talks are pretty useless in themselves, but it was a huge physical risk of Sir James Craig to go and meet De Valera in May of 1921. And number two, it's so obvious. Once Craig, and Ronan Fanning makes his point very well, once Craig is sat down with De Valera, there's going to be a meeting between the Prime Minister in London before too long and the leadership of Sinn Féin. But thank you, Mary. I thought it was a really terrific lecture.
Thank you, Paul. And it's striking. One thinks often as history is moving at glacial pace, but you see just in those few months and few weeks, all these quite rapid interactions and changes of dynamic and perception. Mary Daly, what struck you in Marie's speech and more generally in your reflections on that hinge point in the Anglo-Irish experience?
Well, I think Marie captured an awful lot of the rich diversity of the period, and particularly the political context. Things, for example, like the huge Tory majority in Westminster, which means that there can be diehards, but you can easily lose diehards in any Irish settlement. I mean, the blunt reality is that by the summer of 1921, well, first of all, the IRA could never defeat the British. They knew that, but what they could do is make the price of Britain defeat British victory so high that it was unpayable. And it's martial law, crown colony, or else get out, as Henry Woodson said. And this is a war-weary country. Britain's a war-weary country. A lot of the troops, Paul's been talking about the Dirty War, which I think is very important as well. And then internationally, let's not forget the Americans have been to Dublin, the Americans are watching it, and there is a propaganda war which is not doing much for the British international reputation either. And in that context, Britain, has to acknowledge, they've conceded home rule to Ireland in 1914. Okay, things have moved on, so they can't really impose crown colony as any kind of a long-term solution. That's just not on. So there is a time when some kind of settlement is going to have to be reached, and Northern Ireland is kind of sorted, not necessarily to the liking of an awful lot of people, nationalists anywhere in Ireland, and certainly not to the liking of Northern nationalists, but Northern Ireland is sorted as far as the Tory party is concerned, and as far as Ulster Unionism is concerned. They are, in a sense, off the agenda. And I think what's particularly important for Britain is this modular approach. They can effectively park Northern Ireland. I'm from one of the 9 counties of Ulster, so I tend to use Northern Ireland to avoid that particular identity. And in that context, the other thing that's very important is the shifting nature of the empire and the emergence of dominions as a really significant rank and this is a very recent post-war development. The Dominions were nowhere really in 1914. They're not of any consequence. They didn't come into the agenda in any way. But now, with their role in the war, you have got a kind of a middle ground emerging, Home Rule plus. You have something that where you can begin to place a nationalist Ireland. It won't be a republic, it won't be total independence, but it will be a different kind of settlement that comes in under the umbrella of the empire. And I think it's very interesting that this is happening. Smuts, of course, is also a great role model because this is the man who fought Britain not that long before, and look, where is he now? He's a peacemaker. He's a recognised statesman who is coming to Britain on that basis. So I think all these elements come into play, and they're very, very important. And then the final point, and it's one I hadn't thought of before, Marie, and I think it really struck me, is trust. That Lloyd George had a bad reputation in nationalist Ireland because of that slipperiness over, for example, particularly in 1916 after the Rising, he played two sides of the coin and said one thing to Redmondites and another thing to Ulster Unionists. And there are other episodes as well. He was not. So Lloyd George could have sent all kinds of peace feelers, but there's no guarantee that they would have secured any trust from the Irish. Whereas the King is different. The King had been above all that. His only previous involvement had been Buckingham Palace Conference on the eve of the war. So I think that is very important indeed. And it did come at a time when I think both sides needed some kind of a formula for moving beyond violence into a settlement.
So you have a sort of domestic political context, you have an evolving imperial context, you have an evolving bilateral relations context, and you have almost a sort of an intra-British thing of the monarchy versus the, not versus, but the role of the monarch vis-a-vis the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Maurice, over to you.
Well, first of all, Marie, that was a really incredibly good paper, quite dramatic paper. Well done on that. Now, the King's speech was very eloquent, was very humane. It was really an act of statesmanship. But the point that didn't come out to me from Marie's presentation was why the speech was being given. And it was being given because the Unionists had won. James Craig had won. He had the Tory diehards on whom Lloyd George more and more depended because of his own weak party situation. They were fully behind what had happened, and there wasn't going to be any turning back. He had an administration in place. He had the Ulster Volunteers ready to become the security forces of the new state. So he had won hands down. He had also got the border that he wanted, which would ensure a permanent majority. And that very fact was probably the most profound thing of all, because this was something that no Sinn Féin government could accept. Now, ultimately, they were forced to accept it, but in their own rhetoric and thinking, there was no way that they could accept this outcome. And it was not, as Marie may have said, an issue resolved. It wasn't. It was an issue which would probably, maybe still isn't resolved. It's one of these things that's still there. But it did put, I think there's a context there. What I'm very interested in, Paul referred to this and Mary both did, was the extent to which Britain was prepared to go to retain the unity of Ireland, even if that was as much defending the integrity of the empire, because once Ireland or part of Ireland broke away, and as happened subsequently, other countries were going to go the very same way. But the proposal of a Council of Ireland is one of these great lost opportunities. It reappeared again in Sunningdale. It probably caused the fall of Sunningdale then, and it probably exists today in reality in the Anglo-Irish Council of Ministers. It would have had that sort of a function. Unfortunately, it was an idea ahead of its time, maybe not all that far ahead of its time, because as Mary has mentioned, the evolution of the empire and the Commonwealth in the 1920s was quite dramatic, to the extent that the government of W.T. Cosgrave was able to help bring about some of the changes leading to the Statute of Westminster, and De Valera in the 30s was able to make all the constitutional changes he wanted. So in a sense, the Council of Ireland was, but it couldn't have happened because, and Mary mentioned the word trust there a moment ago, the gap between North and South, partition was inevitable. There was no question of that. The distrust between North and South, the lack of knowledge, North and South. People in the South, the nationalists, knew nothing about unionism or the fears or the aspirations or why the origins of the anti-Catholicism. People in the North knew nothing about the Republic. The Unionists were prepared to ditch their Southern counterparts in what became the 26 counties and do it without shedding a tear. It was quite ruthless the way in which the need for their own majority let them make those sacrifices. So there wasn't ever going to be any meaningful rapprochement between North and South at that time. And the mutual ignorance continued right up to the Troubles, because we saw then how little the politicians knew about each other and how little intercourse there was between the two political groupings, North and South. So they're my first reactions to what was a splendid paper. Maybe one last point, which is the question of the truce itself. And I think Mary has made the case well there that the IRA weren't beaten. They could continue to cause trouble, but they hadn't won, and they probably weren't going to win any military battle. But when I look at what happened on the British side, the speed with which Britain got its negotiators together, the extent to which they were able to work out a very coherent plan for the treaty itself, and had a very powerful group. It couldn't have been more different in the South. There was a sense of chaos after the truce. There was semi-anarchy in parts of the country. The Dáil cabinet had not set about putting a coherent plan together. And then, and this will be in your next series, but when it comes to going into negotiations, the heaviest hitter stays at home, whereas the British put up their strongest team. These are all for later, and I've gone over my time. Sorry.
It's fascinating. And Marie, can I take you back perhaps to the sort of what we know about the conception of the King's speech? Because how far in advance of June was a King's speech first mooted? Because presumably, I think you alluded to this in your talk, it could in theory have been a relatively ceremonial speech. It could have been a speech which just laid out, a sort of description of what the functions of the Parliament would be, whereas the speech which was delivered, that mixture of Balfour and Smuts and perhaps De Valera and others, had quite a distinct political and forward-looking perspective. So do you have a sense of when in the sort of, when that speech was first conceived and by whom, and whether it was, goes perhaps to Maurice's point, was the British government already thinking, say back in February, March, about strategy for the whole of the year in which the speech might lead on to a conclusion of hostilities, and that might lead on to a treaty, or was it much more sort of spontaneous and organic than that?
Well, I think the answer to that, you've almost given it yourself earlier on, was how fast things happened. And it doesn't seem to have been all that long in advance. The decision that the King would come, which was a serious decision to make given the security situation, is early June. It really is quite close to the point. But there's a much wider significant point you're making there, which was the newness of this experiment of devolved government within the UK. not just within the dominions or the empire. This wasn't, this king had, shall we say, previous in this regard. He had opened, on behalf of his father Edward VII, when he was Duke of York back in 1901, he had opened the first Australian Parliament then in Melbourne. So he was good at opening parliaments, but that was different because that was the dominion of the Commonwealth. This was something totally new, and I think a lot of the civil servants, both in Whitehall and Belfast, were scratching their heads, going, what do we do? And there is that flurry. You get it in Tom Jones's diary, that sense of the constitutional appropriateness of the monarch opening not just a Dominion Parliament, but a department in a Parliament in an integral part of the United Kingdom. This is entirely new. They don't know what to do. But that's we're not speaking as much here about the event, I suppose, about the opening of the Parliament. Maurice has touched on it a bit there with the showing how this was what Unionists wanted at that point, at least. This was a very, very important historical moment in British constitutional practice. I know that we've had devolution, say, in Scotland and Wales since 1999. Devolution happened long before that. My colleague Graham Walker has written some very good pieces looking at aspects of Northern Ireland, Home Rule in Northern Ireland, and how they influenced subsequent devolution. So I think there's a lot of newness and not really knowing what to do. And the answer was, this was all decided in the days leading up to it almost.
Paul, would you think that there would have been a sort of constituency in London, perhaps in the Empire as well, who would have been saying to the king, you know, keep out of this, you know, leave this to the government. This is not for you to be involved in. And how more generally would have I think a number of people have touched on it, the sort of domestic political dynamics of Britain, what then only sort of 2.5 years after the end of the war, about a year and a half after the end of the Paris conference, the convulsions of all sorts. How would that sort of domestic context in London, do you think, have shaped the sort of the parameters for what the king might say or might not have said?
Well, I think Mary in her presentation got it right on your first point. I've sensed there are differences in London and in Belfast about what the king actually should say. There isn't much doubt that he should go and say something to push the situation along and make it better. But look, it's an astonishingly difficult moment because what is devolution? Nobody writes books about this in the 10 or 20 years before it happens. What's the theory of it? What's the financial relationship is supposed to be between London and Belfast? Nobody has really a clue. Tom Jones, you're quite right, because he's been a professor in Belfast, has more of a clue than most. But even Tom Jones doesn't really have a clue. So what you're into is something which is an astonishingly quickly decided upon leap in the dark. Everybody assumed, by the way, at the meeting of the Government of Ireland Act was that if Northern Ireland couldn't pay for itself, and there was good reason in recent decades because of the fantastic economic growth of Belfast as a city that it could, everybody assumed if it couldn't, and the truth is it never really did later, it was done for. Actually, it turned out to be one of its strengths, because gradually the doctrine of parity evolved, and the idea that the economic and social standards should be the same in Northern Ireland as in the rest of the UK raised living standards for both communities, which is not to say there was equality between both communities, but there was a definite impulse from London to provide greater financial resources. But everybody assumed the absolute obverse. Everybody assumed if this place doesn't pay for itself, oh, they're done. That's why nationalists said it would only last 5 years, why even unionists talk about it lasting a generation. The Government of Ireland away lasted 5 generations at least and counting. So it's an astonishingly rapidly decided upon leap in the dark. And I agree with everything that Maurice says about Council of Ireland, and he's basically right. The atmosphere precluded against it actually happening. But the Finance Minister, Hugh Pollock, gives interviews at the time saying there is provision in these arrangements for the gradual evolution towards Irish unity. Look at the Council of Ireland. And when Pollock dies, Sean McEntee says, my great friend Pollock has died. Last time I saw him was at Joe Devlin's funeral. There were these amities. There was mostly ignorance, but there were, between some of the key politicians, North and South, understandings, serious conversations. But of course, Morris is basically right. The overall atmosphere was too bitter to get these things going. But worth mentioning these little chinks of light.
Mary, can I ask you about the American dimension? De Valera had been in America, I think, hadn't he, after the First World War? You'd obviously had Woodrow Wilson and his input into the Paris Peace Conference. In terms of the sort of the dynamics in Dublin and in the Sinn Féin leadership, I guess the King's speech and its content must have caught them a little bit by surprise. Do you think there was there a sort of camp that was digging in for the long haul and people who were more ready to look at moving towards a truce? And did the King's speech change the dynamics of that?
I think that there is some evidence that De Valera was doing some thinking about something that was not simply the Republic. And I'm fascinated by Paul's suggestion that he may have had some input, into that speech. But basically, De Valera gave this speech that caused a lot of fuss when he was in the States, which was really the Monroe Doctrine speech, where he looked at Ireland's relationship with Britain and said, let's look at the whole question of Cuba and the United States, that they're going to be near neighbours. Obviously, therefore, as near neighbours, Ireland will have to respect British interests in foreign and defence policies. And this suggests some degree of understanding that you can't just say all out independence, it doesn't matter, nothing matters, break the tie with England or something like that. It's going to have to be a much more subtle and qualified arrangement. And of course, the reality within the Sinn Féin movement was that when they become the successor to the 1916 rebels who declared a republic, Sinn Féin has this compromise resolution at its annual conference, which was that they will achieve a republic, and then having secured a republic, they will then determine what kind of settlement the Irish people would wish, which is you go to the absolute outer independence, but you then might take some steps back. And that was to placate Arthur Griffith particularly, who was not a doctrinaire Republican. And I think the thing about the term republic as used within the Irish context, it just meant full-blown independence. It was never adequately defined. And we're at a stage, it's different by 1920, but in 1914, there are almost no republics in Europe. There's the French Republic, all right, but this is still a world governed by monarchs. That is changing, of course, by 1920. So the Irish had not gone through any kind of subtle reflection. They wouldn't have had the time. They wouldn't have had the resources. Survival was the number one goal, let's face it, to begin to think through what kind of constitutional arrangement they might accept that would be short of a full-blown republic, whereas Britain does that, and particularly through the early months of 1921. I think Britain knows where it's going by the time this speech is made, and it's the Dominion status, as I said, which is something that really looms much larger by 1919 than it had in Britain 5-6 years before the war. So they have a plan in place. I'm afraid I agree completely with Morris. There was no plan in place within the Dáil, and one reason was I think that they might have broken apart because there were some who were really, prepared to, I suppose, push to the limit and fight to the limit, regardless of the realities.
It seems one of those who was very much more in the realist camp than those would have been Michael Collins himself. And one reads afterwards about the sort of relationship that he struck up with Churchill. And I think one of you mentioned earlier that Churchill, having been in quite a hardline position, pivoted towards a realization. Maurice, how much of this does this sort of illustrate the, if not the great man theory of history, the fact that individuals and their political calculations matter perhaps as much, or was it more a case that there was an appreciation on both sides that there was not going to be a decisive victory either way, and therefore the sort of the tectonic plates of the underlying situation was pointing towards a truce and an eventual treaty, or was it a combination of the King's speech and the intuition of individuals like Collins, Churchill and others that led in that direction?
It's an interesting one. I think on the Irish side, when it came down to doing business, most of the key figures were prepared to be pragmatic, to make concessions. Unfortunately, there were two issues in particular which were sticking points, which didn't have to be. The oath of allegiance on entering the Dáil, which De Valera was able to, with the consent and the approval of Cosgrave's government, to walk around. Cosgrave wanted him inside Parliament. He wanted Parliament to work. That could only work when all the elected representatives. But the oath was one, which became a bit of a shibboleth in the end. That was, and of course, the place of the King. And the King was a no-go area for Britain. But I don't know. We'll get into this in the next in your next session on this period. That a comradeship built up among some of the Irish negotiators, which the British negotiators had a chance to build up for months beforehand, working together. But that camaraderie or bonding excluded the other members of the cabinet and excluded De Valera, and most important, wasn't led by De Valera, which was the biggest point. But these sort of personal factors did become very important. Personal antagonisms within the group, all of these things did become factors. But I suspect when it came to the last push, the British weren't psychologically prepared to give up. A few years later, they would have had no problem with these issues, or 10 years later. And I think the Irish maybe couldn't get enough unity behind an acceptance that a bit more time and it'll come our way. But these are the things.
We shall come back to that. We already have some questions from the audience. And the first one is a comparison. And I'll offer each of you perhaps the chance to reply, starting with Marie and working back in this direction. Which speech does the panel consider the more politically significant? The King's speech in Belfast in 1921, or the Queen's speech during her state visit to Dublin and Dublin Castle in 2011? Marie, as a historian, how would you judge the two very different speeches in two very different eras?
Probably the King's, in that it really moved something on. Her Majesty's speech in the more current context, I think, brought closure to a period, but after peace relatively had been there for a long time. What I think is significant, though, here, it's a good point to raise the issue of the role of the monarchy in Anglo-Irish relations. Normally, this is the preserve of politicians. Very rarely does the monarch get involved to such an extent. I mean, I can't think of anything. I know Queen Victoria had some trips to Ireland. Edward came twice, but I can't think of any other interference in Irish politics, not interference, involvement in Irish politics in a positive way by the monarchs. I can think of damaging ones like the George III and George IV on Catholic emancipation. But I think where the similarity between the two is the monarch deciding to play a key role. And I think that's we don't see it very often. When they hold back, but they choose their moments very well.
It must be one of the challenges for any monarch and his or her advisors to sort of tread that path between not saying anything that will get you into trouble, but equally wanting perhaps to say something that will make a positive contribution, Maurice. They both, I guess, in their different ways, were doing that 90 years apart.
I think so. I agree with Marie there. I think that the King's speech did actually move something on in the process. Something came out of it. It made something happen, didn't complete anything, but whereas the Queen's speech was just a confirmation that the two are very good and warm relations between the two islands. And I think the reaction that the Queen got here was indication how most ordinary people felt about it.
An Irish diplomat friend of mine who was in Dublin Castle that night said the hairs stood up on the back of his head when the Queen said those famous words in Irish at the start of her speech.
Again, I think we all have to vote for George V on this occasion. And I think it's important to point out that he actually played quite an active role in a momentous decade or so of British constitutional history, because an event that is less directly related to Ireland, very important, the whole Parliament Act and the removal of the House of Lords veto. He was prepared to appoint a couple of hundred peers that would have wiped out the Conservative majority in the House of Lords. So actually, if you look at the George V story, you find a remarkable amount of monarchical activism and quite significant involvement. In terms of the Queen's visit to Dublin, I had the privilege of being part of the RTE commentary team. And one of the items that I was asked to kind of be a lead commentator on was actually not I wasn't involved that evening, but was at the Garden of Remembrance. And when, I still remember the moment when she bowed and at the Garden of Remembrance and did that read. And for me, that was the most emotional moment. But in many ways, that visit was a symbol of the fact that very good relationships had been established, that the 1998 Good Friday Agreement had resolved an awful lot of significant issues. And I think the other thing that's quite important about that visit to Ireland was again party of esteem that feeds into the work of the Commemoration Committee, because she went both to the Garden of Remembrance, and then the next day she went to Island Bridge to the World War I Memorial. And so she was. So that visit is very much symbolic of a particular era, a very positive era in British-Irish relations, whereas I think King George was actually on the cutting edge and doing things that mattered.
Well, you and I were having a Zoom call to discuss the centenary when the news came through in April of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, and just literally the first call I took after completing my Zoom call with Paul was from Mary McAleese, who had hosted the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh for that visit, passing on her condolences. It must have been a remarkable thing. How was it viewed from Northern Ireland? I guess you were in Belfast during that period.
I think it was an incredibly impressive moment for all the reasons that have been stated. I think one has to go for the King's speech, and part of the reason as being more historically important, and part of the reason is, and it's a function of Brexit, nothing specifically Irish or British in the broader sense, but the truth is that kind of particular amity and warmth, has taken a blow in terms of Anglo-Irish relations since 2016, 2017. And what it shows, however, that visit is that it is possible to have very, very good relations between these two islands. And it may well be possible to get back there. It's the work of statecraft together to get back to that point, because I've no doubt in my mind that is the fundamental underlying wish and desire of both peoples. But we have to be realistic. The happiness of that moment has to some degree evaporated.
Our next question, I'm not sure if this is the start of it on the screen or whether it goes back a bit earlier, but the next question from the audience follows up on something Maurice said. I'm curious about Maurice's point that the various sides in Ireland did not know or understand each other. Would it be more appropriate to say that they did understand each other, but pushed their own points in the rough and tumble of the moment? The Ulster Unionists had strong allies within the cabinet, that means the British cabinet, while Sinn Féin did not. Maurice.
Look, I think we could look at this all night. When the period we're talking about now, just when the beginning of Northern Ireland, the Catholics were driven out of various parts of Ireland, and the reaction of Owen O'Duffy and Collins was that, given lead, that the only way that who in effect were advocating attacks on the new Northern Ireland state, and had to be pulled back very quickly on that. And that was the immediate reaction of both. And look, if you go down through the years, politicians on both sides, in 1948, 49, when Europe was putting itself together after the war, and we had joined the Council of Europe, our only contribution was to wage an anti-partition campaign. And you go to the 12th of July and the terrible speeches being made, anti-Catholic sectarian speeches. And I mean, growing up in the 60s as a student in Dublin, the only Northerners I knew were Catholics and nationalists, because they came down to university here. Maybe Unionists went to Trinity, which hadn't quite got out of its old ways yet at that stage. But there wasn't much mixing. People didn't holiday much in Northern Ireland. People didn't come down here except Catholics on the 12th to get out of the north. But there wasn't any meeting of minds and so on. And it really only began in a serious way in the 70s.
Does anyone else want to comment on that?
There's an interesting point there at the end where it talks about Sinn Féin having no allies, whereas the Ulster Unionists had the allies in cabinet and Sinn Féin had none. You could extend that point slightly and point to the non-existence of hardly any Irish nationalist representation in Westminster. The defeat largely of the Irish Party, which was down to the rump of the Six and T.P. O'Connor, meant that it was very hard for the Irish to have their voice heard where it mattered. So there's a potential criticism, to be a sort of a what-if criticism, if you like, of Sinn Féin's abstentionist policy, and it has come up in more modern times. Paul has referenced Brexit, the absence of SDLP representation in Westminster between, I think it was about 2017 and 2019, led to a lot of dissatisfaction among broader nationalist groups in Westminster that both Sinn Féin wasn't taking its seat at a time when the Conservatives had a very slim majority and were dependent on the DUP. There was a sense that if Sinn Féin had played ball and decided to enter Parliament, now it was never going to happen, but they could have upset the parliamentary arithmetic over Brexit. What you saw in the 2019 election was the return of some SDLP politicians. So I think there's a sense within Irish constitutional nationalism that they don't like to be unrepresented, and I think that's just a point that jumps out at me from that comment about, say, Sinn Féin not having any equivalent influence to that of the Ulster Unionists.
We're going to, in our next event in this historical series, we're going to look at the period between the truce in July and the treaty in December. So we might just finish off with a question which sort of leads us into that. What was the popular reaction across the UK and in Ireland when the truce came into effect? And I suppose I would add to that, to what extent did the popular and or political reaction to the truce sort of prefigure or shape the evolution towards reaching the treaty in December? Was that a sort of an almost inevitable trajectory once the truce was signed, or did the popular and or public reaction bear heavily on that? We'll go around this way, if we may, towards Marie at the end. Paul?
Well, on your last point on popular reaction, when the truce comes into effect, I think it's very clear, about Marie mentioned Phil Kerr, who left government to become editor of the Daily Chronicle. Typically, Daily Chronicle, completely for peace, cut the deal, no going back to war. Most of the British media and most of the British public appear to have thought, thank heavens that's over, let's get on and make this deal. That's why there's a great controversy internally in Ireland about whether or not there was a credible or meaningful threat about immediate and terrible war, because it's very doubtful coming from the Prime Minister. And differing accounts exist on the Irish side of what was exactly said or the tone in which it was said. but it is very doubtful if British public opinion would have stood for it. And certainly Lloyd George's friends in the media took the view that British public opinion wouldn't stand for it. So I think the popular reaction in Britain, basically to the truce and then to the treaty, is of a line: let's end this now. We fought this First World War with honour, horrible though it was, and now we're doing disgraceful things in Ireland. And even the people like Churchill, who felt that they were necessary to do for overriding political reasons, nonetheless, they would describe the IRA's campaign in a famous phrase as organised baboonery. Even people who felt like that about it, nonetheless felt this has got to stop. This has got to stop. And so I think that that's in terms of the popular reaction. And in Ireland, I think in Dublin popular, I think the difficulties is in the north, and it's already been referred to by a number of speakers tonight, that actually the deaths start to go up, relatively speaking, in Northern Ireland, and the sectarian conflict comes into its own. There's a loyalist violence which bears down heavily on the Catholic community, who suffer the most, but actually there is alongside this substantial IRA violence of pure military history, as the records of IRA men saying what they did in this period in Belfast. And these two things together mean that the truce, the answer to the question, I think, is, as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, I'm afraid the popular reaction would have been a good deal more cynical.
Mary?
I think Paul has very wisely highlighted the fact that this, within Ireland, this is a story of two Irelands, that in many ways what's happening in Northern Ireland is on a separate trajectory at this point. The agenda at this point is much more the establishment of the Northern State, and there is serious sectarian violence. There's the setting up of the A specials, B specials, etc. And IRA had really not been around Northern Ireland very much. It's only around then that they come into play. That's where I think great relief that the violence has ended, because it was very disruptive. When you start looking back to this dirty war, the houses that were burnt, the disruption to business, roads blocked, and all the rest of it, people were very happy to see the end of it. And a lot of the volunteer fighters were more than happy to give up living in fairly grim circumstances and get back home. And in fact, one of the problems for the military leadership was that the Volgod saw it would be impossible to get them back out into the field again, was one of the thoughts. And then there's the other group that it gets sneered at, the so-called Truce who, allegedly joined up at this stage when the fighting is over. So I think there was a real worry within military minds that it would be impossible to get them, to mobilize them again and get them back onto the war front. Again, this is when I do think that opportunities were lost at the political level to think through, how are the talks going to go? What are you going to really hold out for? What concessions are you prepared to make? That simply didn't happen at the time. I'm afraid a lot of people did think it's over, the British are going, and there will be a settlement. And the other crowd to bear in mind, I think, are the Irish in Britain, because if you look at the reception that when the treaty negotiation team come into Britain, the cheering crowds that you get on the streets near Downing Street and the train stations, I mean, they are heroes, and they are treated as such, and that's fine, but it can be a bit dangerous as well.
And I guess more as an inference of what Mary is saying there is that, I don't know, perhaps almost the seeds of the Civil War were sown in that period, or perhaps was I mean, this is a question for a whole other day, but to what extent was that inevitable from the whole events of the year or the year before, or was it the nature of the truce and what came after that laid the ground for that?
There was a great deal of looseness after the signing of the truce, and there were atrocities, there was abuse of power, there was stealing, there were various things. Discipline was breaking down. There was, on one hand, as Mary said there, the Irish delegates were cheered when they went to London, and popular support was largely behind them. But there was a fraying at the edges, and there were problems of discipline, which did, in many ways, lead to the Civil War. Sides were being taken at this stage. And there's a very good book on the burning of the Public Records Office, which hasn't been widely noted, and it's a brilliant description of much of the sort of anarchy and chaos in Dublin and in parts of the country at that time. So people were glad the truce was coming, but they were uncertain.
Marie, final question to you, perhaps. Was there something in researching your fantastic paper that surprised you, or that sort of struck you most, which perhaps previous journeys into these archives hadn't brought out?
I think the reception that Neville Macready got when he arrived at the Mansion House on the 9th of July. In the slide there was a picture of Macready meeting the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Lawrence O'Neill, but there is newsreel footage available of it, and Macready has to almost fight his way through the clapping and cheering crowds. For somebody who had no time for the Irish, and I'm sure that up until that date the Irish had very little time for him, I'm sure he was very surprised to be met by such a laudatory reception. So I think that reflects the one word that I would say summarizes the response was relief. And you see that in the Dublin crowd. I think that Belfast, hard to argue the truce happens there at all. Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is full of files, and you take them out and the title is Breaches of the Truce. The UK side of it would be something, that's research we haven't done yet, but there were 10,000 Black and Tans and auxiliaries in Ireland. They all had families back in Britain. Those who died, or often if there were fatalities as a result of ambushes, they had to come to the Irish courts to seek compensation, and they often give some family background. It's quite clear they could not get their head around why their loved one had been in Ireland, regardless of one's view of the Black and Tans, of whether they should be here or what they did. I'm sure their families were very relieved to have them back. The speed with which the British left in early 1922 suggests they couldn't get out fast enough.
Thank you very much, Marie, for your fantastic speech. Thank you to all four of you for your fantastic contributions. I mentioned an Irish friend and colleague of mine who said that the hair stood up on the back of his neck when he listened to the Queen delivering that second significant royal speech of the century on Irish affairs in Dublin Castle in May 2011. He also said something to me which stuck with me as I was preparing to come to Dublin. He said one of the great asymmetries in the relationship is that British people grow up not knowing enough Irish history, and Irish people grow up arguably knowing too much British history. We have four distinguished historians here. We can debate whether that's true or not, but all I'd like to say is a great thank you to all of you for your contribution to tackling some of that asymmetry this evening. Thank you all of you for joining us wherever you are, and we look forward very much to having you with us for the next Glencairn conversation. From the Aviva Stadium in Dublin on this lovely summer evening, good night.